Well, I just wanted to say good morning to everybody. I won't take much time, but my name is Grace Leatherman. I'm the Executive Director of the National Council for History Education, and I did just want to pop in today. There's a lot going on. I'm delighted that Joanne is with us this morning and doing her show once again, and that this is a place that people can gather this morning. I'm looking at the numbers, and people are indeed gathering. So thank you, Joanne. This is a service today. We really, really appreciate it. So I just wanted to say from NCHE, many of you are educators, many of you are not, but to all of you, um, yesterday was tough. Um,
And today's probably just as hard, if not more.
yes, yes. I mean, certainly some hopeful things came out of yesterday, but yesterday was very hard. And for those of you who are educators, and I think there are students in the audience too today. So just to students and educators today, it's okay that today is not a normal day, and today is a day that we can listen to each other. Certainly, teachers, we can teach context, but we also don't have to teach context today. Joanne will do it for you.
I hope.
Um, but I did want to say that just for teachers, and again, for those of you who are with your neighbors or in your workplaces, that today is a day to listen and take care of yourselves. And I am just going to put it in chat, an article from the Teaching Tolerance magazine about how to teach when bad things happen, and it comes out of the principles of psychological first aid. The idea, again, just that we can, when we're with our students, that we can listen and we can protect, we can model calm, and also take care of ourselves, and that those things are very, very important today. So yes, by all means, we will teach context, but the first thing today is really just making your classrooms and your homes and your businesses places for listening and healing. So I did just want to say that. Thank you to you educators who keep taking one more thing. Oh my gosh. And do let us know, just be in touch, how NCHE can be there for you, because we really are feeling for you this morning. And I'll hand it back to you all. Thank you again, Joanne.
Oh,
Thanks, Grace.
thanks, Grace.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. As Grace just suggested, there's a lot to talk about today. And I think all of us, including me, are still sorting through our thoughts and feelings about what we saw yesterday. And obviously that's what we'll be talking about today. And we'll be using history to offer some insights. And then, as always, because some of you are probably new here, what we do every week is I talk for a little while, and then we open things up to a broader conversation. And I will now briefly turn things over to Matt, who will explain the rules of the game for that conversation. Matt, take it away.
Well, this is a somewhat inauspicious beginning to our 2021 season, but it's nice to see everybody again, and I hope everybody had a wonderful break. And just want to echo what Grace shared with you all. This is a time for us to all work together, be together, listen to one another. And as always, if NCHE, particularly myself as education coordinator, can be of help to you or service to you, please don't hesitate to reach out. I can always be found at matt@nche.net. Rules of the game for the day. We are, as always, so if this is your first time, we encourage you to use the chat to have conversations that are germane to our conversation, or what Joanne is talking about. Please make sure that you keep it family friendly. I understand we may have some students in the audience today. So if you do have questions for Joanne, we do a Q&A towards after about 15-20 minutes of listening to some excellent conversation. If you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A section. That's where we're going to be taking questions. So please try to avoid putting questions in the chat. It's hard to monitor while we're doing the Q&A section. So put those in Q&A. And as always, if you do like what we do here at National Council for History Education, please join us. You can go to our website, www.ncheteach.org, and look around. We have some great content, and we have some excellent members-only content. We have all kinds of, we'll be rolling out our 2021 events here in the next week or so. So there's going to be a lot on our docket through the end of the school year that you can rely on for professional development or other ways of engaging in history education. With that, I'll turn it back over to Joanne and we will get started.
Okay. And for those of you who are new, I will simply point out what you're hearing in the background is my rescue parakeet, Newbie, the history bird, who apparently has a lot to say. So that's the little squeaking you're going to hear in the background. He's been very agitated over recent days, I suppose, like many of us. Now, I want to make a few comments before we plunge into today's discussion. Before the events of yesterday, let's see here if I can do this. There we go. Before the events of yesterday, I had planned for this new season of History Matters. We did it for 9 months last year, and in a sense, we're in a new year. We took a break, although we had episodes that were pre-recorded for Christmas and New Year's. But in this new season, I had been thinking, and there was a brief expression of this on Twitter, I think, that we would really talk explicitly about democracy, still about history, but explicitly about democracy in a way that we've been doing all along, but I wanted to bring that front and center, considering the moment that we're in. And so I came up with a title for this season, whatever we want to call it, Talking Democracy. Which again, we've been doing all along, but I want to think about some broader implications this year was my thought. And then the events unfolded of yesterday. And so things have a different turn and a different meaning at this point. So I want to talk a little bit this morning about democracy, about violence, about some of the events of the 1850s, and what they suggest, about what we're seeing now. I'll start out by saying what I kind of said already, but I'll state it at the outset here. Like many of you, I'm a little shaken and trying to sort through my thoughts and feelings at the moment. And I have a lot of thoughts and feelings. So I'm going to be, to some degree, working out what I think with you, first by talking to you and then by talking with you afterwards. So thank you for joining me today for this conversation, because I actually think in a moment like this, this kind of conversation matters a lot. Okay, so let me open by just saying one or two general things about democracy, which sounds very remote and abstract, and that's not how I mean it. I've said this before, and I think it's a good starting point. The thing about democracy is that its glories are also its vulnerabilities. And by that I mean, in a democracy, we, the people, have the ultimate power, right? Public sentiment governs, and that takes different forms, it has different shapes, it has different meanings. That's not a simple phrase, but in the end, that's the glory of democracy, is that we, the people, matter, and we, the people, give people power and take power from people according to our votes. Now, that glory also can be a vulnerability, because in a government where we, the people, where public sentiment and public opinion really rule, that kind of a government can be vulnerable to propaganda, to ill intent. That kind of government means that we, the people, have to be alert and informed. And as I talked about all last year, almost for all of the 9 months, we need to think really carefully before we respond to words, particularly words that are being thrown out by political figures with an intent to rouse emotions and get people agitated and get political support. That's the game of politics, I realize, generally speaking, but sometimes that game is more dangerous than others. And in current times, as I've said again and again and again last year, we need to think about words before we respond to them. And part of the reason for that is specifically because our response to those words really matters. Now, I've also talked before about the fact that the founding folk, the founders, took this lesson about democracy and its vulnerabilities from history. They understood this. They understood and were close students, particularly of ancient history. They knew that there were vulnerabilities in democracy. The Federalists, Hamilton's party, were less comfortable with the workings of democracy than the Republicans. Newbie always has very strong feelings about democracy, and today is no different. The founders, generally speaking, had concerns about democracy. There was a spectrum of views, and Hamilton and the Federalists might have been at what end, but generally speaking, it will not surprise any of you, I know, to hear that the founders were not all gung-ho about full-fledged democracy in the way that we think about it today. They had a qualified understanding of democracy in many ways, and Federalists, and even Hamilton, our sort of seeming cultural hero right now, also had his own understanding of what democracy was and wasn't, and what was good and bad about it. I think in recent weeks, I quoted a really striking Hamilton letter, one of his last letters, if not actually his last letter, in which he warns a friend that the ultimate threat to the Republic, to the Union holding together, is democracy. And by that he means the will of the public, and in his mind, the uncontrolled, unrestrained will of the public. What we saw yesterday, in a sense, is the acting out of some of what I'm stating here. We saw the power of propaganda, or we can step back from that and say strong rhetoric intended to rouse emotions. We saw the power of public sentiment in a really concrete way. It's important to note that what we saw wasn't just protest. I've also been talking all last year about the fact that we have a right to protest the government, but protest is different from invading the national capital. Protest would have been the people who didn't go in the Capitol standing outside and yelling, making their views known, right? That's protest. We all have a right to protest the government. Again, that's part of what democracy offers us, and specifically what our government and the Bill of Rights gives us the right to do. What we saw yesterday went beyond protest. It was an attack on our government. It was an attack on our House. It was an attack in many ways on democracy. It was that severe, and it had a deeper meaning than it might on the surface suggest. It raises at one point, and I'm going to be, I'm struggling here to organize my thoughts, so forgive me if I move in a couple different directions here, but one of the things that yesterday's events show, in line with what I'm suggesting about propaganda and attempts to use words to rouse emotions, is that people who have been dismissing rhetoric from on high, and by that I mean from the national government, from national leaders, people who've been dismissing extreme language from those figures as just performative, right? Just rhetoric, just politics. I think that's a thought that has to be taken with caution. Words uttered by national leaders, and particularly words uttered by America's president, have a power. They're not just performative. They open, when they are calling for violence or endorsing violence, they are bringing that into the American political imaginary. They are bringing that into the arsenal of politics in some way, endorsing it and opening the door. It matters. And what's striking, one of the things that I've noticed, and like many of you, I'm sure I've been on Twitter this morning, and I've been all over the place trying to sort of sort my thoughts and state my thoughts and see what others are saying. One of the things that struck me this morning was just a small demonstration of the power of things that go on in Congress, things that congressmen say, things that a president says, and how quickly that can spread beyond the Capitol. What I saw this morning, some of you may have seen, it was actually the last thing I saw before I fell asleep last night. I was in bed and I was trying not to focus on the news anymore. And just as I was starting to decide to drift off, I saw two congressmen. I saw Connor Lamb basically say that the Republicans who are talking about fraudulent elections were lying, that the public needed to be told the truth. Some Republicans not just objected, but loudly objected and continued to object, although the Speaker Pelosi, tried to call things into order. And then remarkably, what we saw was people spring to their feet and begin to rush over to, again, we couldn't see it. It wasn't on the view of the camera, but what we saw at the margins of was the sort of thing that I wrote about quite frequently in my last book on congressional violence, right? A moment of conflict that is about to become physical, the rushing of people around the hall to that spot, many of them to break it up, some of them perhaps to join in. But what we saw was the opening of the door, not actual physical violence, but people have been calling it, I don't know, a scrum or a scuffle, whatever it was. And I, again, didn't see it. I just saw the response to what was happening. That kind of behavior suggests that things were about to cross a really dangerous line. But what struck me this morning when I was looking at Twitter was people cheering on Representative Lamb, people responding to what they saw and essentially saying, yeah, that's my representative. Now, of course, that's what we do, right? We elect people to represent us. When they represent us, we are happy. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, but when you think about this in the context of violence or things, words that are meant to incite anger and outrage, think about how a speech made by a representative saying those guys are liars and a response to it, instantly I could see on Twitter the response around the country of people responding and owning that moment and being roused by it or irritated by it or encouraged by it, whatever. It was real-time contagion of what was happening in the national government spreading around the nation. That's the sort of thing that last year I was asking us to think about a lot. Now, going back for a moment into history and seeing what history can tell us about this moment, when also there were, at that point, real battles in the Capitol, physical violence in the Capitol that also spread beyond the Capitol's walls, it's interesting to think about the dynamics of that, because what you had eventually, and there were different shifting dynamics between 1830 and 1860 concerning violence in the Capitol, but generally speaking, slaveholders used threats and intimidation and violence to silence and intimidate people who opposed the slave regime in some way or another. So basically, Southerners, the slave power, as they would have been called at the time, particularly in the 1850s, who had a regime, a slave regime that was grounded on violence and felt entitled to power and threatened by the idea that they might lose some of it, and perfectly capable of using violence, entitled to use violence to maintain their power, as they did, in a sense, every day in a culture of slavery. They used that logic in Congress. They used violence and threats to hold on to power, to silence people who were trying to take away their power. So basically, in the 1850s, you see power holders, people in power, desperately afraid of losing power, resorting to what should be extreme behavior to cling to what they feel entitled to in an undemocratic kind of way. That's the logic of the 1850s. That's some of what we saw yesterday. And what we are going to be seeing today, and I don't know any more than anyone else the outcome of that, but the press is a big part of the ensuing conversation around that kind of moment, right? If we have people responding to fears of losing power, who feel entitled to that power, regardless of the democratic process, we now have a free press responding to it. The press has sometimes and has not sometimes responded in an optimal way to unfolding events in recent years. It'll be interesting to see how they respond today. As I suggested at the outset, words really matter in this kind of an instance. The words we use to describe things matter. Headlines will matter. Calling this, some unrest versus an attack on the Capitol, things like that actually matter, will shape opinions. And we need to think hard, all of us, whatever our views, on the words that we use and how we respond to those words. So I put that out there with no great conclusion from that, but only to say, watch what happens today and think about it, and think about what is or isn't being said, because that matters a lot. Which takes us to, in a sense, a general and final point I want to make before I open things up. What we saw yesterday was people who feel, as I just suggested a moment ago, entitled to power, and demonstrating that they feel entitled to that power and feel entitled to use violence and threats of violence to maintain the hold of that power. They're afraid of people who they consider not like them, and often those are people with different political views or people of color, that these people are claiming too much power and need to be shut out. The big question now is what happens next. Those people proved yesterday, who did what they did, that they're not entitled to power, right? Because they violated the pact of democracy, the constitutional pact of democracy that holds us together as a nation. We have processes for things. That's not a process, a democratic process. But that said, then what, right? What happens next? How do you confront this sort of thing? Now, in the 1850s, what happened is you had Southerners becoming increasingly violent in defending their slave regime and trying to silence people who were opposed to it. In the mid-1850s, you have the beginning of an anti-slavery party, the Republican Party, that declares itself there to fight the slave power. That's their rhetoric. And what you see in Congress, and again, what happens in Congress and the words in Congress matter, you see Republicans, Northern members of Congress, again and again and again, rising to their feet in Congress in response to threats and challenges and violence, and basically saying, yeah, you're not going to get away with that anymore. Like, that's not acceptable here. We're not here to back away from that. We were elected and put here to stand up against it. Now, I'm not suggesting, and they weren't suggesting, that the answer to threats and violence is threats and violence. That's not what they were saying. But what they were saying, and it's worth thinking about, is that there is a line in the sand, right? There is a line that shouldn't be crossed. And it means something. And there should be an attempt to uphold that line, to defend that line, not necessarily with violence, but by standing firm. These men weren't eager to fight. They didn't want to fight. They weren't itching for a fight. They were just basically saying, you're crossing all kinds of lines, and we can't let that happen. So what's interesting now, and I'm a historian, so I don't know what will come next, but what is the real question now is what comes next, and what kind of accountability, what kind of reaction is going to be happening in response to what happened yesterday. I've said it a lot on History Matters. I said it a lot on Twitter in recent weeks. One of the things at the heart of democracy is accountability, that the people who we give power to are accountable for their use of that power, accountable to us, and that they can't escape blame for it and should be held accountable for their actions if they seriously cross lines. So what kind of accountability are we going to be seeing in this moment? When I use that word, I think it's important to state, I'm not speaking in a tone of vengeance or revenge or even hostility. I'm just saying that there has to be some accountability for actions that seriously cross a line. Accountability with justice, accountability that is fair and within our system of government, but accountability in this moment is really going to matter. That's what I, as a historian of violence in Congress and of political polarization, that's what I'm really watching to see now. What happens, how do different people address this moment, what comes next? There's obviously no consensus about what comes next. Again, just judging from Twitter, I see all kinds of things, demands for impeachment and removal from office. And I have no idea, demands to fire the Capitol Police who allowed this to happen, demands to arrest them. There's a lot of stuff going on Twitter right now. And as we all know all too well, Twitter registers things, but it isn't necessarily always a guide to things. At any rate, I guess maybe that's where I'll lead off in this discussion of democracy and violence. Violence is always a threat within democracies, which is where I started out. What matters is how we respond to those threats. And what matters is our ability to respond with firmly, but with justice, not in a spirit of revenge, but in a way that upholds democratic values and doesn't violate them. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. I think I just managed to cohere some thoughts. I'm really, like many of you, truly shaken by what I saw yesterday. In some ways, I understood and could believe that it was happening because of all of the rhetoric and what we've been watching in recent weeks. On the other hand, I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and that's particularly true given what I write about and what I study, right? I was watching the enactment of things that I didn't think I would ever see in the national Capitol. And I was watching, the desecration of spaces that were intended to be symbolic of American democracy. Seeing people with these flags sort of pushing their way through what is now Statuary Hall, but was originally the original House of Representatives. That was stunning to me. That was shocking to me and made me beyond angry. I don't even quite know how to process what I'm feeling right now. But there's a reason why the symbolism of the Capitol matters. It means something. I think my response, and I'm sure many of you had the same response to what was going on yesterday, what we were watching, when I say it was an assault on democracy, it was that in a very real sense, and it was that in a symbolic sense, because of the very many things that like the things I'm saying here about just watching people invade those spaces without rights and vandalizing the Capitol. So I think I'll pause. I will just say that I join you in feeling a big rush of emotions at this moment. As a historian of political violence, I'm very caught up in this moment and still processing. And I will continue to do that with you over the course of the next half hour. And I hope that we, generally speaking, will continue to discuss this in a serious way, without screaming rhetoric, but instead with real concern about what comes next. So I will stop there. And we can open things up to comments and questions. As I said at the outset, it's so important and so wonderful that we have this community here that for 9 months has been meeting every week to talk about what's going on around us and its import and its implications and how it affects us and how we should teach it. So I thank you all for being here for this. Okay, back.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. Excuse me. And so we do have a couple questions here that we'll start with. And I see those are being populated. So again, put those in the Q&A section. Also want to, because we do have so many teachers, I do want to invite questions. Normally I would try to avoid stealing any kind of thunder here from Joanne because she's so brilliant and so thoughtful. But I do want to invite questions about from educators who might have trouble processing how to teach this, and we try to offer. I'll be happy to try to offer some ideas for that beyond those that Grace offered earlier.
I also want to make one comment, only because,
yes,
as always, every week, for those of you who are new to this space, I have a mug, because this is History Matters and Civics Coffee. I have a mug that in some way reflects the discussion of the week, the topic of the week. And get my lipstick off of here. This week, my mug is blank because I really have no words, in a sense, for what we saw. It was, in many ways beyond my capacity to express my emotions at this current moment. So that's my representative mug for the week. And Matt, every week, has a background that is topical. This one is wonderful. It is the Statuary Hall, which is the original House of Representatives. I thank you for that, Matt. That just makes me happy just seeing it.
Thanks. I made a joke before we started recording, but I also did think about some different ones, but this seemed just appropriate. I've used this one in the past, and it just seemed like a good day to revisit this one. It's one of my favorite spaces in the Capitol. So our first question, and this is, I'm going to ask this in a historical way from Melissa. Can legislators be removed for supporting violence? How would that happen? Can you put that in historical context, whatever ability you can?
Well, can legislators be removed for supporting violence? One of the problems, one of the issues to consider here is that laws and policies, customs and assumptions and enforcement are not necessarily in sync or constant over time. So in the period that I focus on and that I've written about, there were discussions now and again when people, misbehave, when there was violence on the floor of Congress, even the caning of Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate, right? There was discussion, these people should be expelled. And there was discussion of that because there wasn't even necessarily agreement of that. It rarely happened in the past. America was also a much more violent place, and politics was routinely and consistently violent. So it was a different time. I at this particular moment, I can't answer that question because we've been watching 4 years of norms and rules and laws be followed or not followed in unpredictable ways. So, saying something can happen and that it will happen are not necessarily the same thing. I honestly, in an extreme way, mean what I said during my comments. I'm really, really curious to see what happens next because it really matters. And this is one of many ways in which it's unclear what's going to happen, but it matters more than I can say.
Sorry, I had muted because I have children yelling in the background.
That's okay. Life.
Because life happens.
Life happens.
So Ashley asks an interesting question, and there's been a long evolution of the two-party system with parties sort of coming in and out. We're currently in a Democratic Republican sort of stage, but it's certainly hasn't always been that way. So Ashley asked the question, do you think the deep divisions in the country will result in the breakdown of the two-party system? I just want to alter that slightly, Ashley, with your permission, which is, do you think deep divisions in the country throughout history what are the effects of that on the two-party system? I think that's a better question for us to think through in a historical sense.
Well, I think talking in the long term, the dissolving of national political parties often reflects moments of extreme polarization. That's not surprising. So in moments when you see national institutions of all kinds being challenged or failing or breaking down, it makes perfect sense that parties are a national institution that, generally speaking, fuel and motor politics, but that in these kinds of polarizing times can't contain what's going on in a moment. So, part of what you see, on the one hand, we could talk about polarization. On the other hand, we can talk about parties aren't containing it in some ways. So look at the 1850s, when the Whig Party vanishes and there's a new party, the Republicans, and the Democratic Party is splintering. And that's a moment when national institutions of all kind are shattering. And that's what you see on the national stage. Despite the extreme polarization of what we're seeing right now, what we're also seeing, and what people are commenting on without saying it necessarily this explicitly, is parties that aren't cohered, that aren't joined, right? There's a extreme left and central part of the Democratic Party, and there's what the sort of Trumpian part of the Republican Party, and then the sort of Mitt Romney part of the Republican Party. And are they all Republicans? And is that one party? Those aren't false questions. Those aren't questions without import. we're in a moment, and for the last few years, we've been in a moment where there have been a lot of national institutions that have been chipped at and eroded. To me, this is just another case of that being the case. Political parties can cause polarization, but they also can be a way to contain it by structuring contests and competition. So their collapse is not necessarily a good thing, as tempting as it might be to say that, say, oh, darn party politics. It has a purpose. It accomplishes something. And so like everything else we're talking about this morning, that's a thought that has to be considered. And I think we really, this is not a new thought. I certainly, like many others, I've been thinking a lot in recent years about the fact that our national parties are splintering and that we might emerge from this moment down the road with different parties at the core of our system. I don't know. Or more than two parties. I also don't know. But that's a good question.
Alyssa asks the specific question to your book, The Field of Blood. In The Field of Blood, you explained about how censures like those against John Quincy Adams and Joshua Giddings were considered so severe that Giddings resigned and was overwhelmingly reelected. Do you think that censure has the same power and severity today?
Well, here's what's interesting about that. I would have had a different answer before yesterday. So I would have said, in a sense, no, right? Because a censure seems like very formalistic kind of, toothless way of saying, we don't like what you've done. And that how, in a culture of honor and reputation, that might matter more. However, what we saw last night when there was that moment of near violence on the floor of the House, what we saw was a congressman rise to his feet, outraged that he was called a liar. That's what that moment was about. He was outraged that someone had called him a liar on the floor. He wanted the words taken down, right? He wanted them to be objected to formally on paper. That's striking to me. That was someone saying, these are unacceptable words, and a line has been crossed, and my reputation and the reputation of my allies is being sullied. So that's kind of an acting out of the power of something like censure. That's about reputation and political power and political clout. I can't even tell you folks in how many ways I'm watching some of what's going on now and thinking, I wrote about that. I wrote about that. And I wrote about people having strong feelings about that. And now I have strong feelings. It's a little surreal in many ways to be seeing what's going on now, but I am learning from it. If I wrote The Field of Blood now, it might have a different tone or some different ideas in it, because experiencing things and studying things are two different things.
Eric asked a question, and Eric, no last name, so I can't give you any more credit than Eric. Says, it's been very difficult to see the comments from Russia, China, Iran, etc., both due to the embarrassment, but also how they're exploiting the situation. Can you talk a little bit about how? So, Eric, I'm going to reframe your question just a little bit here. He asked, what historical presidential examples are there that compare? How did America rebound from similar presidential disappointment previously on the international stage? I think maybe based on your expertise, could you just talk a little bit about the effects of international sort of conversation about tense political moments in the United States throughout history? From your, I think that's what this question is really getting to.
Well, this touches on an interesting idea that I think has long been true, generally speaking, for Americans and how they think about their government and what it symbolizes and what it is and how it stands on the world stage. From the very beginning, from the founding period, many Americans have thought of the United States as, I know this is the cliche, kind of a city on a hill, right? We are creating standards of democracy and free and fair government, and we will spread the flame of democracy and free and fair government around the world, right? We are the model of this kind of government. When people saw the French Revolution happening in the mid and late 1790s, what some Republicans, Jeffersonian Republicans, thought was, see, the spark of liberty spreading around the world, right? Here we are, we're the ones creating that. And I think in many ways, we as Americans have always assumed that that's our identity. But I think we have also always assumed, in a not very helpful way, that our democracy is immune to things that happen around the rest of the world, that somehow our democracy is better than everyone else's, and that we are always going to be a cut above everyone, that we aren't sincerely and severely threatened as a democracy, really, because of course, you know, it can't happen here. I think, and I've been saying this for years too, I think that's a dangerous way to think about things, because I think it encourages you to not take unfolding events seriously and to ignore things that you should think about seriously. Of course it can happen here. And what we're seeing now is the rest of the world, in some cases, taking advantage of the fact that what is supposed to be a standard of democracy now revealing itself to the world as not quite working as a democratic polity at this particular moment. And in some other cases, just people watching in other countries kind of agog at the idea, the ways in which there's such a visible collapse of democratic standards going on right now. You know, particularly now in a more globalized world that's united by media and the internet, nothing exists in isolation, but the United States and its sort of symbolic role in international affairs, that's been tinkered with over recent years in many ways that I won't go into right now. But I think this is, again, part of this larger pattern of national identity and what the nation stands for being redefined under this administration in ways that are still in progress.
Super helpful just to frame it that way. So I want to go through the questions one more time, so I'm going to ask a different question. So this is this person who I don't think is here, Tina Hefner, who is a professor of social studies at UNC Charlotte, former National Council for Social Studies president. In fact, I think she's the immediate past president right now. Was writing about something I'd love to hear your comments on. She was writing about this on social media, and she talks about the time when General George Washington, at the end of the Revolutionary War, faced down insurgents, members of the army who were aggrieved and were going to go to Congress and stage an armed rebellion. I wonder if you might comment on that, and maybe do you see any parallels between that situation and what's going on today, or do you think they're wholly different sort of animals?
Okay, so what we're talking about is the Newberg Conspiracy, which was a group of officers who were outraged that they weren't being paid, that were talking about rising up in rebellion. Washington learned of this, and his response was to go to the site, to go to Newberg, to the site of the conspiracy, and to address, you know, the Newberg conspiracy or conspirators. He did something that there are a couple of ways in which this has modern echoes. One of them has to do with what he did at that moment, right? A lot of people yesterday were talking about how important it is a president's response to things that are beyond bounds, or a president's lack of response to things that are beyond bounds. Washington went to the spot of trouble, stood up before these officers and addressed them about the meaning of what they were doing, the severity of what they were doing, and made it very personal. I always jokingly refer to all of these founding moments when people began crying. There are like a lot of crying moments in the founding, right? You really know someone's hit home with some politics when the room bursts into tears. There are some congressional addresses. Fisher Ames, a Federalist, like apparently people broke into tears at his oratory. This is another crying moment because Washington brought along comments with him to see them. He needed his glasses, and supposedly he pulled his glasses out, and as he put them on, he said something like, "Forgive me, gentlemen, but I have grown not only gray, but blind in the service of my country. And supposedly at that moment, the tears opened, right? But whether there was actual crying or not, and there very well might have been. What's interesting about that moment is that was a leader who was on the spot, was going to address what was going on, and who made it personal, right? It was a personal statement, and he personalized it in that moment in a really extreme kind of a way. So that's a moment, comparing it with the present, that's certainly a moment of leadership and a demonstration of leadership that worked, that mattered, the ways in which it matters, what a national leader, even if it's a general versus a president, does at these kinds of moments. That was effective, whether he made them cry or not. I always refer to glasses moments when I think about crying founders. It's like, oh no, he's reaching for the glasses, there shall be tears. But that shows you the power of the symbolism and meaning of leadership.
Mm-hmm. That's I think that's super helpful as well. Thank you so much. Joe asks, so first, Joe, congratulations. He's going to be beginning to teach a class on Homeland Security.
Wow.
And he wants to know, which I think is great, what interesting course to teach. In your research, have you discovered any noted changes pertaining to the protection of congressional members through the years due to violence at the Capitol? So this is a question about the security surrounding congressional members across U.S. political history.
Well, I don't know all of the ins and outs.
I don't know if you can answer it.
Pardon? I missed what you just said.
Oh, I said I don't know if you can answer it.
Right. I don't know all the ins and outs.
I said I don't know if you can answer it. I just said
I don't know. I don't know all of the ins and outs, but what I can say is there are rules and there's enforcement, right? So, in some cases, members of Congress can have weapons in their offices, but not on the floor. What that means and how that's enacted, I don't know. Obviously, that came up recently with a new member of Congress declaring that she's going to go to the Capitol with her gun. But again, rules and regulations are one thing and enforcement is another. And given the propaganda value of that kind of thing right now, I don't know what's going to be the impact there. What varies most over time, more than anything else really, is enforcement. That's in a way one of the themes of what the comments I've been making today is. It's one thing to make declarations and it's another thing to enforce accountability in some way. I just love the fact, I can't even tell you how agitated Newbie is. He's just like, democracy.
I just want to say, Richard, Richard asks a really great question, but I'm going to save it for the after party. I think it's a better after party kind of question. So just wanted, Richard, if you're wondering why you're not, I'm not asking your question.
Oh, can I make one comment just based on
go ahead.
something I saw in chat? Carrie asks if I heard the prayer of the Senate chaplain this morning who said words matter. I did not, but I will just point out the fact that yes, indeed, that is an ongoing theme that I've been saying and that clearly it matters.
So one of the things that sort of is, it's not in the periphery, it's at the foundation, I think, of some of the issues that we saw yesterday. It has to do with the question that Steve is asking here, which is, does history offer us any lessons about how to manage the clear racial disparity between how different mobs, I'm just going to reframe, Steve, I apologize, how different groups seeking protest and or insurrection are handled? So this is a question about the racial disparity that we see between various groups that either protest or cause violence.
Well, on the most basic level, history teaches that that's a pattern, right? History teaches, and not just recent history, that's something that has deep roots, right? That certain kinds of people are above the law and other kinds of people, in a sense, are beneath the law and are deprived of basic rights. And we've been talking about it throughout, in recent years for good reason. We've been watching it, particularly with, video evidence of some of this happening in ways that are forcing people who have denied that sort of thing to actually reckon with the fact that it happens. Yesterday is more of the same. And I've seen a lot of people online saying the obvious, which is if those protesters had been Black, they would never have gotten past that first barricade and there would have been bloodshed. And how can you deny that given everything that we see? But the important thing to note here is this isn't something that's born of the moment. This is something with really deep roots in American history. It is something that we have to reckon with and that we haven't reckoned with. I am encouraged sometimes at the fact that it's more present in public debate than it has been, I guess, in my lifetime. That's a starting point. That's not a finishing point. But what we saw yesterday is a blatant example of that fact once again. And again, what's going to happen to these, what will be the accountability of these largely white, what am I going to call them? Mob members, and what will be the accountability for some of the Capitol Police that seemingly welcomed them in. I don't know that. I can't claim that. I don't know the proof of that, but I saw video this morning of them opening the barricades and allowing people to pass through. Yet again, with all of you, I'm going to be watching to see what happened there and what it means. There's so much floating around right now that has potentially can have a lot of different meanings. And what that meaning will be depends on, the response in the next few days, actually the next few weeks, because the incoming administration is going to have to reckon with this too.
It's really helpful. And I appreciate your use of the word mob there. I think, and this is one thing I've struggled with, and I agree with you that words matter, and what to call these people, I think matters.
Well, right. Words really matter, right? So mob, terrorist, sedition,
insurgent,
all of those words matter a lot. A lot of words, I've talked about this before too. We're in a moment where people are tossing around those sorts of words as buzzwords.
Right.
Liberty, freedom, democracy, sedition, traitor, Nazi, fascism. Exactly. They're throwing around these words because they have buzzword value. And we're in this moment watching Matt and I kind of reckon with the word we choose to use in this particular moment is an example of the fact that, once again, words matter. And, mob members is an easy one. Terrorist, I might, and probably did on Twitter yesterday, use that word. Those kinds of words matter. Sitting here and addressing, however many 200 of you who are here watching at this moment, I will say that we have to think about how we use those words. I'm not saying not to call it terrorism, but I am saying when you use that word, you should definitely stand behind it.
Mm-hmm. Turning our attention to the media, one of the images that struck me yesterday is the group that threw all of the recording equipment from the AP on the ground and were stomping on it and kicking it and tried to damage, recorders and things like that. So Thea asks, that brings me to Thea's question, which is, do you have any thoughts about the role that threats of violence against the media will have on media coverage and what we have seen in the past? And you and I, we've talked about the media, ostensibly newspapers at the time, throughout American history in some pretty powerful ways over the course of season 1, which you should go to our website and watch immediately. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about this idea of threatening the media and people who are sort of covering the national moment, and what we can learn from history about that.
Right. And that's a great question, because I also saw footage yesterday of people, kicking press equipment and destroying cameras and other things of reporters. And someone wrote something like "murder the media" or something that they wrote on the wall of part of the capital. So that matters in a lot of ways. Related to what I've been saying, a free press varies, right? So a free press is vitally important, and also there's a spectrum. Along the lines of words matter, what the words that a free press uses matter, that's the sides they take or don't take matter, and they can have an impact that isn't always positive. But that said, one of the reasons why a free press is important is because it is a tool of accountability, right? What a free press, what journalists are supposed to do is watch, report, investigate what's happening, and show us, the American public, what's happening. Now, as always, this has always been true in American history and generally speaking. You can look back to big controversies in the 1790s and see a Federalist account and a Republican account, and you would be hard pressed to know that they were the same event, right? And one of them is like riot and chaos, and the other is, yeah, there were a few people standing around. So that's a longstanding problem of a free press, but part of what a free press does, and part of what it consistently does, is report to us, show us what our government is doing, and ideally with evidence. So some of the attack on the media that we've been seeing is actually an attack on that, right? Some of it is, we don't like the media saying things that we don't like. We don't like the media showing us up in ways that we don't like, so we will shut them up, right? We don't want to be held accountable in that way, so we will shut them down. Shut them up, shut them down. So that's some of what I thought was going on yesterday. And that's, I think, authoritarian regimes, there's a reason why they seize control of the press. Accountability, democracy needs accountability. Without it, you get something very different.
Oh, good. I did unmute.
Oh, I do want to address this. Gloria said, did not the anti-Trump bias press incite this hatred or occur? Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that any one side is entirely responsible for things that are less than useful in the press. I'm actually speaking in a general way about the press, that we've seen examples of really effective reporting, and we've seen examples of really not, of dangerous reporting, of irresponsible reporting. And, I think that in a general way, what do I want to call it? The Trump supporting press has been really instigating strong feelings. And again, I think sometimes violence in a way that is not useful, not responsible. That said, the liberal press sometimes has drawn conclusions or made assertions, not asking for violence necessarily, but making claims that are less than useful. So I don't think this is a both sides thing. I don't actually think that both sides are using rhetoric in the same way, but I do think that words matter on both sides.
And I just wanted to just quickly say to Gloria out there, I know you're regular, and I've noticed that you've asked a couple questions, which I saw after I asked a very similar question. So with apologies for not addressing your questions earlier today.
And thank you for asking that, Gloria.
Yeah, they're very, very helpful questions. I apologize for that. Well, it is 11 o'clock. I just noticed that. Oh my goodness. It seems like I had 20 minutes. I guess it was 20 minutes ago that I had 20 minutes. So,
wow.
So with that, I'll express my apologies to folks who I did not get to your questions. If you want to stick around for the after party, we will talk a little bit about those once we're not recording. And otherwise, just thank Joanne for her time today. Thank everybody for coming today, and letting folks know that, again, if you want to find out more about who we are as an organization, please make sure you join us at www.ncheteach.org, our new website, new web address. So,
and I will follow up what Matt just said by explaining that the after party, as one of our History Matters community branded it, is what we slide into after our hour of conversation, and that's a less formal, unrecorded conversation. If you just stay here, you'll be in it. But it's a moment to talk in a less formal manner and to kind of, engage as a community in a way that we don't necessarily do as freely when we're having a serious conversation. So anyway, feel free to stay around for the after party. For those of you who won't stay around, please come back next week, because I feel like I repeat myself over and over again, right? Having this kind of community matters, but it does. And particularly at this kind of moment when I know a lot of us are frightened and alarmed and unsettled and unsure of what's going to happen, and not quite sure where to turn and not quite sure who to trust. You can trust conversation. Because it matters. And the fact that we can have a conversation here and debate things in a normal way in which we respect each other and really wrestle with difficult ideas and issues, that really matters. So I invite you to stay with us Thursday mornings, 10 o'clock a.m., to be in a space where this kind of conversation is welcomed and really encouraged. It's so important. And I encourage you to spread this kind of conversation, and teachers, I'm with you in pondering what it means to teach in this particular moment, looking ahead to the next semester. I'm a political historian who teaches early America and the Constitution. So that'll be interesting to see what I do with that. But again, this kind of conversation and our ability to ask these kinds of important questions matter, and that matters in the classroom too.
And with that, we will end. We stop the live stream and stop the recording.